and thank you for coming. It's been a busy day for the investigative team here in Alaska. The investigation's continuing at the airport in Soldotna, here in Anchorage, as well as in our offices in Washington, D.C. Earlier today, the wreckage was moved from the crash site to a secure hangar at the airport. After the wreckage was moved, we've discovered a large ground scar where the engine impacted the ground. And by the way, we did not find any additional cell phones. Investigators have removed the engine and a propeller. The engine will be sent back to Honeywell for teardown and analysis. The remaining wreckage will be examined closely to determine the positions of the flight control surfaces, trims, and the like, so we can understand what the position of controls were at impact. We're still determining what components we want to send back to the laboratories in Washington, D.C. for further analysis. We're in the process of obtaining maintenance records, weight and balance records, and other records, pilot records, and we'll be attempting to develop our own independent assessment of what the weight and balance situation of the airplane was. Investigators are conducting a 72-hour, developing a 72-hour history through interviews with appropriate folks. This is a typical analysis. This is a typical process that we do for all aircraft, for all transportation accidents, frankly. We are continuing to look for witnesses, and if anybody has any information, images, or personal accounts, you can email us at the address witness@ntsb.gov. That's witness@ntsb.gov. Let me shift for just a minute. I'd like to take this opportunity to talk a little bit more about general aviation safety, and this is my opportunity now that I'm up here in Alaska. I'm fully aware that how dependent Alaska is on general aviation for transportation, for just normal life in Alaska. General aviation consists of corporate flying, business flying, instruction, and personal flying. Now, at the NTSB annually, we investigate about 1,500 general aviation accidents a year. About 100 of those or more occur in Alaska. Although this accident involved a Part 135 for-hire operation in the aircraft, these same types of aircraft are used in general aviation flying more broadly. Now, over the past decade, the accident rate for general aviation accidents has remained relatively flat. If you break it down and look at corporate flying, which has improved, business flying, which has improved, instructional flying, which has improved a bit, that leaves personal flying, and that's getting worse. It's getting worse to the tune of about 20% increase in the rate of accidents over the last decade, about 25% if you look at fatal accidents. That's the reason why we've added general aviation safety to our most wanted list, and it's been on the list now for the last 2 years. As part of that activity of our most wanted list, we developed safety alerts. Safety alert looks like this. It's the trifold. It describes the problem, describes the solution, gives some examples, shows what resources are available. And we've issued, as I said, 5 of these. So, for example, preventing aerodynamic stalls at low altitude. That is a leading generator of loss of control. Reduce visual references. This is also known as continued VFR or visual flight into instrument meteorological conditions. Also spatial disorientation. Risk management for pilots, risk management for mechanics, and then finally, you'd be surprised how often we have a mechanical problem with an airplane, and the airplane has been trying to tell the pilot for several flights that not everything was well. So those identify many issues that are also Part 135 issues, but they're particularly Part 91 issues, personal flying issues that we would like to try to reduce as much as possible. These safety alerts, I've got some examples, but they're available on the website at ntsb.gov. And we would particularly like those to be put in the hands of pilots, their passengers, their friends and family, so that everybody has a chance to understand where improvements can be made and how they can be made. So this will be our final on-scene briefing here in Alaska. It, however, is not the end of the investigation. It's really just the beginning of the investigation. You can get additional updates on the investigation status at our website, ntsb.gov, or follow us on Twitter at NTSB. With that, I'd be happy to take a few questions.
How significant is it starting to look on balance, weight, load of the plane? Is there any indication that it was unbalanced or overloaded?
Is there any indication that the weight and balance was an issue? And the answer is we don't know yet, but we are in the process of making certain that we do find out.
But how could you find out if a lot of it burned?
Well, the medical examiner has been helpful in determining weights. The operator has been helpful in determining what got loaded on the airplane. The lodge has been helpful in determining what they got invoices for in terms of the supplies and freight. We're weighing the baggage. We're weighing everything that comes off the airplane. So we will be able to develop, we think, a fairly good estimate of what the weight is. And then the balance, where people were sitting, we have a pretty good idea of that as well.
Have you been able, oh, sorry.
How many hours have the plane been flown in the last 6 months or a year?
How many hours has the plane been flown? I don't have that number handy, but my understanding was it was an airplane that was being used frequently. Yes.
The weather report for that day said that at 4,000 feet there was 19 knots wind speed. Why do you think this plane, if the wind shear did cause it to fall, or that be relevant? Why would that wind speed? I mean, that is at 4,000 feet, so it obviously didn't get there. But at 1,000 feet, it was 7 knots. Is that large enough to cause a crash?
No, frankly, those wind speed of 7 knots at 1,000 feet really is kind of a light and variable wind. Those are not significant wind speeds by any means.
As far as cargo on the plane goes, have you been able to determine if there was anything of significant weight that may have shifted a load balance? And this is beyond, personal baggage. I mean, were they taking anything out to the lodge of significant size and weight that could have caused something like that?
Well, were they taking a significant amount of freight out to the lodge?
Or even one specific thing that may have thrown it off balance?
No, our understanding is that we had 9 passengers with baggage, but not a lot of baggage because they, I believe, were intending to stay just one night. Then the lodge had some provisioning, some food, and we're getting guesstimates of what those foodstuffs weighed. So, that'll go into our assessment of the weight and balance.
But that was it. There were no larger things going out to the lodge there.
As far as we know, there were no larger things going on, and no large things that would shift the balance significantly.
Mallory Peebles, Channel 2 News. We talked about, you said an operator loaded the things onto the airplane. Could you tell us a little bit more about that? So this person didn't see anything, but he helped put everything on the plane right before it took off?
No, the pilot did the loading.
Oh, okay. You said an operator loaded.
Well, the operator of the airplane. So he came in with the airplane. It had the provisions already loaded on the airplane. He then loaded the passengers and their baggage and proceeded to taxi out for takeoff.
Okay. As far as maintenance of the plane, were they on time, or were they lax about any of the maintenance schedules? Do you know?
So the question is, as far as maintenance goes, how was the operator doing?
Yeah.
And that's one of those things that we spend a fair amount of time making sure we understand. I don't have information at this point in time.
Do you know when the plane was last maintained?
I don't have that information, but we're certainly collecting that kind of
Okay, so
information.
you are looking.
Oh, yes,
obviously.
yes, very much.
What
I
was the
understood that-
last? Oh, go ahead.
I understood that those planes were able to hold as much as 9,000 pounds on board. Is that correct?
The plane would not hold 9,000 pounds. The plane might weigh 9,000 pounds with fuel and passengers, and so.
I guess my question is there any understanding that it could have exceeded that much weight on?
Is there any indication of, was the weight excess, is really the question. And that's why we are doing an independent weight estimate and balance calculation, so that we understand that. The airplane was originally delivered with a reciprocating radial engine, and it was modified with a turbine engine with a great deal more horsepower. And so we're also working to understand what the performance increment was because of the turbine engine.
So you don't know the max weight that it could handle yet?
At this point, no.
What do you know about the last 72 hours? You said you were trying to reconstruct that. What was the last flight you took?
I don't know that. I don't know what the last flight that he took was, but we're, associates and so forth, so that we can understand not only what the flight and duty times that the pilot may have been occupied, but also sleep patterns, sleep times. We look for fatigue. We look for anything that we can identify.
One clarification about the 135 rules. I understand that this was a 135 operator, but are there times when 135 operators might take a flight as under 91 rules if they weren't being paid directly by the guests or the clients? And is this one of those cases by any chance?
Well, this was certainly a Part 135 flight because they were being paid to carry passengers to the lodge. A flight could be a Part 91 flight if it was a repositioning flight, for example. If the airplane did not carry anybody for hire, then it could be flown as a Part 91, which most general aviation operations are, in fact, under Part 91.
And you said the scar that was seen when the wreckage was removed. What kind of stuff can you learn from that? Like the speed it was going based on how much of a scar there is?
What can you determine from a ground scar? Well, the first thing you can determine is the direction that it was moving at the time of the impact. It also gives you some kind of qualitative idea about how fast it was moving in the horizontal direction. The depth gives you some qualitative idea of what the vertical velocities were, but these are not something that you can back up and say, well, it was so many knots in forward direction and so many knots in vertical.
But it just is part of the picture.
It's part of the picture, yes.
Oh, I was going to ask, getting back to the 135-91 thing. I've flown a lot in Alaska, and it's not unusual for the pilots to pack a plane and balance out the passengers, but 10 people is a lot. And you're saying he did not have an assistant at all. Is that a factor of pilot stress, or perhaps, in the haste and the amount of work that had to be done, something was overlooked? I mean, you were saying that at 91, it was a 135 because he was being paid by the lodge and had no employees. But if he had an employee, he would have had to pay somebody else to assist him.
No, I'm not sure I understand the question.
Do you think the pilot was overburdened and having to
Was-
9 people and all that stuff?
Yeah, was the pilot overburdened? No, I wouldn't think so. I would think this was kind of a normal operation for him.
I know the lodge used him a lot to bring in guests. And, do you know Have you looked into, would this have been an abnormally large crowd that was taken in one trip, or, 'cause I'm sure they weren't flying 9 people every time. Have you come up with any average?
Have we come up with an average number of passengers, or was this unusual?
Yeah.
No, I don't believe it was unusual. The airplane, as I understand, had that many seats in it. So, properly weighing people, making sure that they got the weights within the capability of the airplane, and loaded it so that it was still within the weight and balance envelope. This should not have been an abnormal operation.
With the pre-accident history, or the accident history on this specific aircraft, it looks like in 2003 there was a similar incident where it was flying about 80 feet and caught fire, hit bushes and caught fire, or hit trees, I'm sorry, and caught fire. So would that have been a factor that it previously has had crashes before? Would it have factored, I mean, obviously mechanical, they would have stepped in, but would that be an issue?
So the question really is, does a prior accident create the likelihood of having another accident? They owned the airplane for 3 years. So this prior accident that you're mentioning, was prior to them owning the airplane, obviously. But the restoration of the airplane should be such that the airworthiness of the airplane is not in question. So the answer really is no. The airplane should have been repaired back to airworthy condition. It would have to have been repaired to that point, actually.
Have you been able to take any of the data off the phones or get anything from spider tracks from that satellite? That cloud of information?
Yeah, we're still working on what information we get out of spider tracks and what information we get off the cell phones. It takes a fair amount of work back in the laboratory in Washington to get information off cell phones. So we are hopeful. We would love to have somebody have taken video, but we have no indication that that's the case.
You mentioned that aerodynamic stalls at low altitude are among the leading generators of loss of control, and you've mentioned before that you're looking at loss of control as one of the possible factors in this crash. And yesterday you kind of described the plane's attitude when it impacted the ground as right wing down, nose low attitude, and that's kind of a classic indicator of a departure stall situation, isn't it? So is that something that you're kind of looking at as far as this goes? Do you believe this plane was in a stalled attitude when it impacted the ground?
Was the plane in a stalled when it impacted the ground? We're really trying to determine that. And that's one of the reasons why we want to go back and identify what the flight control positions were at impact. Yes, that attitude is consistent with a stall at low altitude, but not necessarily the only reason that that attitude, impact attitude, might have occurred. So the answer is yes, we're looking at it, certainly with a great deal of interest, but we have not determined that that was the case.
You also mentioned yesterday that the prop was bent, and were all 3 of the blades bent, or was it just a couple of them, or what was it?
It was a 4-bladed prop,
Okay.
and all of the prop blades indicated impact with the ground, which means the propeller was rotating at impact. And if my recollection serves me right, all the leading edges of the propeller blades showed some gouging due to terrain, due to ground contact.
Last question. Thank you very much.